Welcome to Sliver Stories. Tonight, leave the world behind. This journey is your sanctuary, crafted to lead you into a deep, restful sleep. For 30 minutes, we will travel through light and shadow. Let these scenes quiet your mind. Then, as the screen fades to black, our story will deepen, carrying you into the quietest corners of your dreams. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the journey begin. Aldous leaned his forehead against the cool glass and watched the rain claim the world outside. It came in long, slanted lines, driven sideways by the southwesterly that had been building since yesterday afternoon. And where it struck the window, it did not simply fall, but spread, each drop opening briefly into a small, branching shape before surrendering to gravity and joining the slow rivers already moving down the pane. He had watched 10,000 storms do this. He watched this one the same way, without hurry, without anxiety, with the particular quality of attention that only comes after a very long time in one place. The oil lamp on the sill was warm against his left hand. He had not moved his hand from the base of the lamp in several minutes. He was aware of this without being troubled by it. The warmth was good. The steady warmth of glass that had been heated slowly from within over many hours, and his hands were cold from the earlier walk on the balcony, and the warmth moved into his knuckles, and the old scars across his palm, and the stiffness in his first 2 fingers that had been there since a winter's night 20 years ago, when a rope had taken him by surprise. The lamp smelled of burning paraffin, a smell he associated with no other place on earth than this room, than this particular lamp on this particular sill, a smell that was, for him, the smell of home. He looked at his hand in the amber light. The lamplight did something to age. It softened the obvious things, the deep lines across the knuckle, the roughened skin, while somehow making other things more visible, more dignified, the architecture of the hand, its long history of use, the way the tendons moved beneath the surface. He turned his hand slightly and watched the light shift across it. In the paintings he had seen reproduced in the book upstairs, Vermeer, the Dutch master of domestic light. The hands of ordinary people look like this, lit from the side by the cool north window, given back their significance by the painter's refusal to look away. He was not a painter, but he had looked at this window for 31 years. Outside, the Atlantic rolled in with a boom that he felt before he heard it, a low reverberation that came up through the stone floor and into the soles of his boots and the bones of his legs, and then receded, and came again. 10 seconds between each wave. He had counted them enough times to know without counting now. The interval told him everything. This swell had traveled a very long way. It had been at sea for days, building its long, slow architecture out of sustained wind over open water, and it had arrived here at the foot of his cliff, with all of that accumulated distance still in it, still in the sheer mass of each wave, the weight of 1,000 miles. He had known this ocean for 40 years. He thought, and still it surprises me, not with fear. He was far past fear, but with something adjacent to reverence, the feeling of standing before something so much older and larger than himself, that the comparison ceased to be diminishing and became, instead, a kind of relief. He was small. The ocean was immense. This had always been true, and would always be true. And there was, he found, considerable peace in the permanence of that arrangement. He pressed his forehead a little harder against the glass, The cold of it moved into him cleanly, the way cold always moved into him now. He breathed slowly. His breath fogged the pain below his forehead, a small cloud that bloomed and faded and bloomed again. Something about tonight felt different. He could not have said what, precisely. The storm was not exceptional. He had seen worse, far worse. The solitude was not new. And yet, he lifted his head from the glass and looked out into the dark. The Atlantic looked back. He turned from the window. It was not a decision exactly, more a slow gravitational surrender to the warmth that had been waiting for him across the room all evening. Patient as everything in a lighthouse learned to be patient. He crossed the few steps to his chair and lowered himself into it with the particular care of a man whose body has begun to make its opinions known, his joints announcing each degree of descent until he was settled finally into the worn leather that had shaped itself over many years to the precise geography of him. He reached for the mug on the small table beside the chair, both hands. He always held it with both hands, and had done since the first winter here, when he had learned what cold really meant, what it meant to need warmth, not as a comfort, but as a requirement. The ceramic was thick and rough glazed, and had been warming beside the fire long enough that the heat of it moved immediately into his palms and up through the stiffness in his fingers, and he held it there a moment before he drank, simply holding it, eyes half closed, feeling the steam rise against his face. Chamomile tonight. It had been chamomile most nights this winter, a small tin of it on the shelf above the range, the smell of it mild and old and faintly of honey, a smell that belonged entirely to these late hours and to no other part of the day. The fire spoke in its particular language, a sharp crack first, the kind that came without warning, a pocket of resin or trapped air releasing suddenly from deep in the log, and then the long, low, continuous conversation of burning wood. A sound so layered and so constant that it occupied the same register as silence, became part of the silence rather than a disruption of it. He watched a small shower of sparks ascend the chimney and disappear. The heat reached his shins first, then his knees. Then gradually it climbed and softened the deep ache that had lived in his lower back since the afternoon walk on the balcony. A slow unraveling, the way a fist opens when it finally has reason to. Outside, the storm continued its vast, indifferent labor. He could still hear it, the rain against the seaward wall, the deep boom of the sea below. But from here, from this chair, in this firelight, those sounds had changed their character entirely. They were no longer the weather he stood inside. They were the weather at a distance. The fire made that distance. He looked at the room around him. The left arm of his chair glowed amber. The right arm retreated into a warm brown shadow. He had read, in a book somewhere, that Vermeer painted shadow not as the absence of light, but as the presence of something else, something that had its own weight and its own texture. He thought of it now. The mug warmed his hands, the fire warmed his face. He sat at the center of it all in his worn leather chair, and felt, there was no other word for it, at peace. Not happy necessarily, something quieter than that, something that did not require anything of him, that asked no questions, that simply was. He took a slow sip of chamomile. He closed his eyes. He set the mug down. He did not plan to. One moment it was in his hands. warm and familiar, and the next it was on the table beside the chair, and he was already straightening, already responding to something that was less a thought than a pull. The kind of pull that 31 years of duty had worn so deeply into him that it no longer needed his conscious participation. The lens was above him. The lens was always above him, in some sense, even when he was not thinking about it, even in sleep. He crossed to the base of the stairs and began to climb. 47 steps, his left hand on the iron banister, his right brushing the curved stone wall. The stairwell was cold and close and smelled of the damp that lived in old stone, and his boots found each step with the automatic confidence of a man who had made this ascent in darkness, in pain, in the full fog of interrupted sleep, and had never once missed his footing. The steps spiraled upward, and the cold deepened as he climbed, until by the time he pushed open the heavy door at the top, the air that met him was sharp enough to feel like a correction. Then, the light, even after 31 years. The lantern room stopped him for a moment. The Fresnel lens filled the center of the space the way a small sun might occupy a room. It turned slowly on its mounting, driven by the quiet electric motor below. And as it turned, it gathered the light from the lamp at its heart, and bent it, and concentrated it, and threw it outward in a beam of such intensity that the glass seemed like a rupture in the ordinary world. Aldous stood still for a moment and let his eyes adjust. He knew every ring of it. He knew the small imperfection in the third prism from the lower left, a faint internal striation, invisible to any casual eye, that he had been watching with an almost parental vigilance ever since. It had not changed in 30 years. He checked it anyway. He reached for the chamois cloth on the shelf beside the door. As he moved around the lens, the light caught him in passing, a sweep of concentrated gold that crossed his hands and his chest and his face with each rotation. He watched the dust motes drift. He thought about how much was always present in the air, that ordinary light was too diffuse to show. He pressed icky fingers to the brass ring at the base of the rotation mechanism. The hum came up through his fingertips before it reached his ears. He moved to the gear housing and crouched, and breathed in the smell of the lubricating oil, thick and mineral and faintly sweet, a smell that spoke of engineering and precision, and the kind of care that expressed itself through maintenance rather than sentiment. He stood slowly and began to work the chamois across the lower prism faces, small circular movements, unhurried. The cleaning was not only about what it removed, it was about the contact itself, the attention, every 12 seconds, dependable as breathing. He worked the chamois slowly across the upper prism ring and felt beneath the tiredness and the cold the particular satisfaction of a man who knows precisely what he is for. He descended the 47 steps again, this time in reverse, the iron banister cold under his hand, and the warmth of the lower rooms rising to meet him. He could feel the threshold where the cold of the lantern room gave way to something more habitable, and then, reaching the bottom, the lingering warmth of the fire that had burned itself down to embers. He crossed to his desk. It stood away from the window, because the lamp gave better light here, the amber pool falling directly across the desk's surface, without the distraction of the darkness behind him. There were things he had stopped questioning long ago, and the position of the desk was one of them. The map was already spread there, weighted at its corners. He had left it out from the afternoon, unable to close a line of thought that had not yet reached its end. He sat down, drew the lamp a few inches closer, and looked. The paper was extraordinary under lamplight. Each time the light changed, the map became a slightly different object. Its surface had developed a topography of its own, creases that had become permanent, ridges of folded paper that caught the light on one edge and threw a shadow on the other. The map was itself a kind of landscape, creating mountains and valleys from its own history. He leaned forward on his elbows. The coastline was rendered in ink that had faded to a warm brown. The boundary between land and sea was more suggested than stated, a soft, imprecise line. Coastlines were not precise. They were arguments between land and sea, conducted over geological time, with no final resolution in sight. He reached for the telescope. It lay beside the map, its brass body cool and solid under his fingers. He felt the maker's mark beneath his thumb. P.H. 1863. Someone had looked through this same glass at this same water 160 years ago. Then he reached for the pencil. He held it loosely over the map and let his eye find the lighthouse, marked as a small starburst symbol. 2 flashes, 12 seconds, the raven's teeth. He traced the pencil tip along the dotted line of the reef, not pressing hard enough to mark the paper, just following the grain, feeling the resistance of the Haritanian Duzencies, the history of the paper transmitting itself into his fingers. On paper, the ocean was calm. The treacherous shoal was simply a notation, a piece of information to be respected. The paper ocean did not heave. It did not conspire with the wind. It sat flat and still under the lamplight, perfectly manageable, perfectly legible. He looked up for the map and out through the window. The real ocean was still there, still doing what it did. The darkness beyond was still absolute. The 2 oceans, the one on paper and the one outside the glass, seemed as different as 2 things could be, and still share a name. And yet, the map was true. He used the flat calm of the paper to think about the violence of the water. That was what maps were for, finally. To make the mind capable of what the eye alone could not manage, to hold still, for long enough to think, the thing that was never still. He set the pencil down. He smoothed the map once with the flat of his hand, feeling the warmth that the lamp had given to its surface. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the lamba burned on. He smoothed the map one final time with the flat of his hand, feeling the paper beneath his palm, the warmth the lamp had given to its surface over the course of the evening. Then he reached for the journal. It was on the right side of the desk, where it always was, a thick leather-bound volume, its cover dark with years of handling, the leather soft in the particular way of things that had been touched daily for a very long time. He opened it to the current page, where the ribbon lay, waiting. He uncapped the pen. It was a dip pen. He liked the brief shininess of new writing before it settled into itself. The scratch of the nib on the cream paper was the loudest sound in the room. He had always found this a comfort, the way that the act of writing produced its own small specific sound, the sound of interiority, of the world being, for a moment, filtered through one person's attempt to account for it. November, he wrote. Storm continuing. Force 7 to 8. The lens is clean. The log is current. He stopped. He looked at what he had written. Then he dipped the pen again and continued in a slightly different register. And yet I find myself at the desk at this hour, because something about tonight resists the ordinary closing of the day. The lamplight fell directly across his hands. He noticed the way the light found the ridges of his knuckles, making a landscape of them. He had read once, in the book of Vermeer reproductions that Eleanor had shown him years ago, that hands were where a life was most legibly written. Eleanor. The name arrived in his mind without announcement. He set the pen on its rest and sat back slightly. He remembered a garden, the small walled rectangle in Falmouth, where she had kept herbs and a rose, and a wooden bench that caught the afternoon light. He remembered the smell of the rosemary she brushed past, how the smell of it reached him a moment before she did. Always. He picked up the pen again. There are gardens, he wrote, that continue to exist in a person long after they have ceased to visit them. I think mine is still there. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass. Inside, the ink dried to its quiet mat, and the lamp burned on, and the journal received what he gave it, as it had always received, without judgment and without reply. He capped the inkwell. The small brass cap seated itself with a soft, definitive click that seemed, in the silence of the room, to mark something, the closing of one thing, the beginning of another. He set the pen down, pressed his hands flat against the desk, and pushed himself to standing. His back made its opinion known. He stood fully upright and waited for the ache to settle into its usual position, a constant if manageable companion. He reached for the lantern on the shelf beside the desk. It was a small brass lantern, old, its body dented in 2 places, its glass panels hazed with years of use. He lit it from the lamp on the desk with unhurried efficiency. The small flame inside steadied itself. He crossed to the base of the stairs. The cold met him at the threshold, inhabiting the stairwell the way cold inhabited old stone. He stepped through and began to climb. The sound of his boots on the stone was the first thing. Each footfall sent a dull, resonant thud upward along the curve of the stairs, so that he climbed in the company of his own faintly lagging footsteps, a shadow sound that followed him without ever quite catching up. The lantern moved with him. Its light was a small, warm circle that preceded him up the curve of the wall, finding the surface's irregularities, illuminating each of them briefly before moving on. The shadows suggested the thickness of the walls and the weight of the stone and the 170 years of Atlantic weather that the tower had absorbed. He thought they breathed those shadows. He was not a fanciful man, but the movement of the light produced something that registered as movement, as life, retreating and advancing in a slow rhythm that had something organic about it. 7, 12, 19. His left hand trailed the banister, the iron cold under his palm, textured with the memory of 10,000 storms. 26 steps, halfway. He paused, suspended between the 2 worlds that constituted his life, the domestic and the dutiful, the fire and the lens, the chair and the climbs. He looked up at the remaining stairs curving away into darkness and down at the stairs below, where the warmth of the room was already only an idea. He lived vertically, in one place, going up and coming down, tending the point where the earthbound light met the sea-dark sky. 31 years. He thought each step a year would not even reach the landing. He put his foot on the 27th step and continued upward. The echo of his boots spiraled into the dark above, and the smell of the sea grew stronger, that clean, mineral, honest smell. 47. He pushed open the heavy door at the top, and the lens turned before him in its slow golden revolution. He stood for a moment in the light. He came down from the lantern room for the last time that night. The descent was slower than the ascent had been, the body knowing that what waited at the bottom was rest. His hand on the banister was heavier, each footfall simply completing itself and releasing him to the next. He turned at the bottom, towards the small corridor that led to his bedroom, and he pushed open the door and stepped inside. And he stopped. He always stopped just inside the door. It was the room doing what the room had always done to him, making him register that he had arrived somewhere that was entirely and specifically his. He set the lantern on the nightstand. The room received its light. It was a small room with a low ceiling of whitewashed plaster and a floor of the same worn stone as the rest of the lighthouse. The walls were thick. They absorbed and held the sound of the storm until it became something almost gentle, a distant and muffled presence. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached down for his boots. The stone floor was cold through his socks, a clean, hard cold, returning it slowly as well. He set both boots together beside the bed, aligned as he always set them. Then he straightened and put his hands on the blankets. They were heavy, the good, serious weight of thick wool. They smelled of cedar, and beneath the cedar, the older, warmer smell of wool itself, performing its last and most gentle function. He pulled the blankets back and lowered himself into the bed. The mattress received him. He lay still for a moment, finding the position that his body had found every night for 31 years. His hands rested on his chest. His eyes were open. The beacon reached him every 12 seconds. It was not a disturbance, but a varlock, a confirmation, the rhythm of his own lighthouse marking time above him while he lay below. He watched it now, the ceiling dark, then the light arriving from the left, a warm amber stripe moving with slow, deliberate grace, washing briefly across the face of the book stacked on the nightstand, and then diminishing and gone. Dark, then 12 seconds of dark, then the light again, arriving exactly as it had arrived before, unhurried and precise. He looked at the books. He read slowly, because he had found that reading it slowly was better than reading it quickly, in the same way that the evening was better than rushing towards morning. He had no family here. He had these. He closed his eyes. The beacon crossed the ceiling above him. Dark. 12 seconds. Light. Dark. The storm was very far away now. It was outside and he was inside, and the walls were thick and the blankets were heavy. He breathed slowly. He let the 12 seconds carry him. The storm did not know there was a man inside. This was the first thing to understand about the relationship between the lighthouse and the Atlantic on a night like this. The ocean brought nothing personal to it. The waves did not arrive with intention. They arrived with momentum, and momentum simply continues until something stops it. The cliffs had been stopping it for a very long time. They were chalk and flint and limestone, receiving the waves with the absolute indifference of great age. The rocks at the cliff's foot were black and slick. The waves found them with a sound that was less like water and more like detonation, a deep, concussive boom that repeated and repeated. The water exploded upward in a column of white spray, reaching the tower's base and running down the rough stone in long, pale rivulets. The tower stood in this without comment. It had stood in this since 1847. It had been struck by lightning. It had been shaken by earthquakes. It had been maintained with the continuous, unglamorous diligence that old stone buildings required to persist. It had persisted. The beam swept from the top of it in its 12-second arc. Regardless, from out at sea, the lighthouse would have looked like this, a white tower in darkness, 2 flashes of gold arriving from the black, and then gone, dependable, unvarying, and below the sweep of the beam, small and warm and very nearly invisible, a single window, amber light, a lit window in a storm, the oldest and most human signal there was. Someone is here. Someone has made a place of warmth. The waves did not care about the window, but the window was there anyway. The tower absorbed another wave. The beam swept its arc and swept it again, patient and exact. And yet, the window held its light, and the tower held its ground, and inside, the man who was somehow indistinguishable from this place lay in the dark and breathed in 12-second intervals, keeping time with the beam above him, performing their long, quiet, necessary duet against the storm. The Atlantic roared. The lighthouse answered with silence and with light. He could not have said what woke him. One moment he was under the blankets, settling into the deep horizontal heaviness of sleep, and the next he was awake, completely awake. This was immediate, a switch thrown in a dark room. Something had changed in the wind. He did not know how he knew this, but something in the register of it had shifted, as if the storm had turned its attention. He put on his boots. He took his oilskin from the hook. The main room was dark now. He crossed to the outer door, unlatched it, and pushed it open against the wind. The cold was total. It covered his face immediately, like cold water, and with the cold, the salt. He pulled the oilskin close and crossed to the balcony railing. His hands found the iron. It was colder than the air. He held on and leaned slightly forward into the wind and looked out. The sea below was enormous. He could hear more than see it. He knew this coastline in the dark the way he knew the 47 steps. He looked west. He looked west because something asked him to. Not a sound, not a movement, something else. An old knowledge, watching the sea for long enough that it had begun to watch back. And there, at the horizon, something flickered. He went still. It was small, smaller than a star and lower than a star. It flickered in the way of something alive, in the way of a flame. A flame at the horizon in a force 8 gale. He gripped the railing harder. He leaned. He stayed. He looked at the light. It did not extinguish. It held its position with a steadiness that was inexplicable. It flickered like something that was simply, stubbornly alive. Aldous felt moving through him, something he had not felt in a very long time, a recognition without an object. Finding it now, here in the last place he would have thought to look. The wind pressed against him. The beacon swept above. The waves spent themselves in the dark below, and the light on the horizon held. His thoughts began to loosen from the present, to drift backward along the long corridors of 31 years. The light flickered. He held the railing. An old man on a balcony, a dark sea, and a light where there should be no light. And as the world around him dissolved into the indigo dark, the light remained, and the long vigil of his memories began. The light held its position on the horizon, and Aldous held his position at the railing, and between them lay the dark Atlantic, and nothing else. He was no longer cold, precisely. He was beyond cold, in the way that certain extremities of sensation eventually became their own kind of numbness. His hands on the railing were part of the railing now. His face was part of the night. He stood and looked, and let the looking take him backward, the light on the horizon pulling at some thread in him, whose other end was tied to something very far away and very long ago. Her name was Eleanor. He had not said her name aloud in perhaps 15 years, perhaps more. It was one of those names he kept in the interior, in the part of himself that was not for speaking, the part that only became accessible in moments like this one, late, dark, cold, the ordinary defenses of routine suspended by the specific strangeness of an inexplicable light. Eleanor. He had known her before the lighthouse, before this coast, before this tower, before the 47 steps and the Fresnel lens. She had been a painter, someone for whom the act of putting color on a surface was the way of finding out what she had seen and what it meant. She painted light. She had Vermeer's eye without having studied Vermeer. He remembered the winter light falling across the pages of a book on her kitchen table, a woman reading a letter by a window, a jug of milk being poured, suspended in the amber morning. She had given him the vocabulary for something he had already been feeling. He had loved her. He said this to himself now at the railing in the dark, without qualification. He had loved her laughter, which was sudden and unguarded, a laughter that embarrassed her sometimes, and that he had found entirely irresistible. He had kept her letter. It was in the desk downstairs, in an envelope that had gone soft with years of being folded and unfolded. He had written back that first winter. He had written several drafts. He had sent none of them. This was the fact he lived with, not the losing of her, but the letter he had not sent. 3 drafts telling Eleanor what she had given him, what the Vermeer kitchen had meant, what the particular quality of her attention had meant. He had not sent it because he had believed that first winter that there would be time. He had believed there would be time. The light on the horizon flickered. He watched it with the same quality of attention that he'd brought to everything this evening, but the quality was different now, more exposed. He thought about why he had come here. This was a question he had answered many times, over 31 years, and the answer had changed. He had told himself, in the early years, that he was, by nature, a person who needed more quiet than the world generally offered. This was true, but there was a third thing, something he had not told anyone, until the provisional answers had begun to feel insufficient. He had come here to wait, not for anything specific. He had not been waiting for Eleanor. He had been waiting in the way that the lighthouse itself waited, not passively, not emptily, but actively and with purpose. The lighthouse did not get to know in advance which night mattered. It kept its light burning on every night, because any night might be the one. He had come here to keep the light burning on every night, including the nights when the horizon was empty, including tonight. He thought about the word cathedral. What a cathedral was, fundamentally, was a space built to hold something larger than itself, to create a space whose architecture was determined by the direction of attention. His lighthouse was vertical, like a cathedral. It pointed upward and outward, and he lived inside it, quietly and daily, performing the small acts of maintenance, the sweeping of floors and the polishing of the brass, That was the liturgy of the place. He had not been running away. He rejected the version of his story where the lighthouse was a hiding place dressed up as a vocation. He had been here. He had been here in the full sense of the word, doing the work, maintaining the relationship with this coast and this sea. He had not been hiding from the world. He had been living in a particular part of it, very carefully and very completely. The light on the horizon still burned, and he thought, and still it surprises me, the way the life had been in the end, sufficient. The way the quietness had turned out to be, not empty, but full. He had waited, and something had accumulated. He was certain of that. The light moved. He noticed it the way he had learned to notice things at sea, not by looking directly at it, but by holding it in the peripheral field. It had moved. It was closer, measurably, observably closer. 3 miles, perhaps. His hands tightened on the railing. He did not reach for a rational explanation. The evidence was a light where there should be no light, burning with the quality of a flame, moving through a force 8 storm in open water. It was coming here. The recognition of this arrived, not as shock, but as something closer to completion. The lighthouse was the light. The lighthouse was what things in the dark steered toward. He had spent 31 years being the thing in the dark that could be steered toward, and now something was steering. 2 miles now. The light moved as if the storm were happening in a different dimension, as if it were navigating through a version of this night that was calmer, or older, or simply indifferent. He thought about Eleanor's letter. He thought about what she had been trying to say, about the particular joy of being alive to a world that would not hold still. He thought, if I had sent one, if I had sent even one, 1 mile, the beam swept, and the light was there, warm gold against the dark gray of the storm sea, unwavering, 1/2 mile out, and bearing directly for the cliff. His breath was loud in his ears. He was aware of his own heartbeat, and of the cold that had worked into the core of him, and of the iron railing in his hands. He thought, whatever this is, I have been keeping the light for it. He had been keeping it for this, for the night when something came out of the dark and needed to be received, needed the light to be burning, needed a keeper to be here. He had been here. He had always been here. The light reached the cliff's foot. He knew this before he could see it, felt it as a change in the quality of the darkness below him, a subtle warming of the air, or something else, something that had no name. He leaned over the railing and looked down, and in the white water, in the narrow margin between the cliff's base and the sea, the light was burning. He could see it directly now, a flame, the warm gold of it, the living variation that distinguished open fire from any artificial light, burning as if the storm were happening somewhere else. He watched it for a long moment, then he straightened and turned and went inside. He moved through the main room in the dark. He knew this room in the dark completely. He moved to the base of the stairs and he paused there and listened. The storm outside, the distant boom of the waves, the wind at the door seams, and beneath all of it, a sound at the outer door. He was not certain it was a knock. It was too soft for a knock, too tentative. A hand laid flat against the metal of the door. The sound of contact, rather than the sound of asking, as if whatever was out there already knew he was in here. He descended the final stairs. He put his hand on the latch. He was not afraid. All the years, all the mornings at the lens, all the evenings at the fire, and all the letters written and unsent, all of it had been the approach to this door, to this latch, to this moment of standing between the warmth that was his and the dark that was her. He was awake, utterly, completely, entirely awake. He pressed down on the latch. The old mechanism engaged, and then gave way, and the latch turned, and the hinges groaned, and the secret on the horizon finally stepped across the threshold, leaving only the silence of the storm behind.